One of the things this coronavirus quarantine has made very clear to us is the fact that presence matters. Presence matters. Being with each other really matters. Now, this may not be as true for you if you're an introvert. You may have liked some of the separation. And yet, even if you're very introverted, you know that separation can be very damaging and it can be very dangerous. Separation can lead to deterioration in relationships. And separation of certain types can be very dangerous. We think of a child being separated from their parents. That's a dangerous situation. Maybe you can remember as a child, maybe you kids can remember a very recent experience of being separated from your mom or dad. I remember a time in the grocery store when I was very young, 14 or so, and I got separated from my mom, and I was petrified. I looked around, she wasn't there, and I moved over one aisle, she wasn't there. I moved back a few aisles, she wasn't there, and I realized I had no idea where she was. And that separation was incredibly frightening to me because I had a sense that it could be very dangerous. And in contrast to that, presence brings with it peace. Presence is really a foundational thing in a relationship. And so we're going to talk today about the presence of God. Now you may think this is like very simple, straightforward, nothing really profound about it. If you ask me, where is God? I know the catechism question. God is everywhere. Where is God? God's everywhere. The presence of God, it's everywhere. Simple, done, and dusted. But when we dive into this and really think about it, it's far from just an easy, simple thing that we can affirm but then quickly dismiss. It's actually very profound, and it's profoundly practical and profoundly helpful for us to really dig in deep and understand what the Bible teaches us about the presence of God. So that's what we're going to do today. In the first place, we need to recognize that the Bible talks about the presence of God in a number of different ways, a couple of different ways that we're going to cover. And the first way we want to think about God's presence is the fact of his omnipresence. Omnipresence. Now, that simply means that God is everywhere. The word omni is a Latin word meaning all, and present, meaning presence, of course. Omnipresence, all presence. Omnipresence is a reference to the fact that God is everywhere. But there's some ways we can think wrongly about this. It's not the case that God is everywhere because he is like a giant creature that stretches out, and so some part of him is touching every place in existence. In other words, he's like us, taking up space, but he just takes up a lot of space. He takes up all space, so that he's everywhere in the sense that one part of him's over here and another part of him's over there, but he's got everywhere covered because some part of him is in every place. God's omnipresence is not like that. He's not everywhere in that way. Rather, to say that God is omnipresent, we need to understand that means God transcends the category of time and of space. He is above space. He's not confined in any way by space. He's not just really big like us in space. He is above space. He transcends it. And this is brought out in a passage in the Old Testament in 1 Kings chapter 8. Solomon had just built the temple, and he's dedicating the temple, and he's praying to God in dedicating the temple. And he says this about God. He says, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?" See, Solomon knows that God is going to be present in the temple, and that's what he's praying for. But he also knows that God isn't contained within the temple. Nothing, no space, in fact, can contain him. Because as Solomon says, heaven and even the highest heaven cannot contain you. Heaven and the highest heaven. In other words, no space, nothing in creation, not created space, can contain God. He is above it. And this makes perfect sense when we remember that God is an infinite spirit, an infinite spirit. A spirit meaning he's not defined by material properties. He is not bound by the stuff of creation, and he's infinite. So he's not bound by space, and he's not bound in an infinite fashion. So when we say God is omnipresent, we mean that he is above even the category of space. But when we say that God is above the category of space, we don't mean that he isn't at the same time in a certain way in space, present with his creation. He transcends it, but because he transcends it, he can be fully in it in an infinite way. So theologians have thought about this and realized that this means that God is everywhere in the fullness of his being all the time. It's not that God, part of him is over here and part of him is over there. It's not that God is completely absent from space, but because he's not contained by space, he transcends it. In his infinite presence, he can be with every point in space fully. So all of him is here and here and here and here and here and with me and over there and in Nebraska, of all places. God, in the fullness of his being, is everywhere. As Psalm 139 puts it, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. The psalmist is saying, there is nowhere I can go where you are not. And he means that God, in the fullness of who he is present in all of these places, and not because he's just chasing him around, but because he is, in the fullness of who he is, everywhere. God is omnipresent. But there's another way that we can talk about the presence of God, and this is a very important way for us to think about it, because it's emphasized for us in Scripture. It's the most common way the Bible talks about the presence of God. The Bible not only references the omnipresence of God, the fact that in his essence he is all the time everywhere, it also talks about his relational presence. His relational presence. In other words, it talks about God being present as a way to discuss his relationship with humanity. Now, there's a number of different sides to this. In the first place, this can be bad news. God's relational presence can be bad news for sinners because God shows up in judgment against sinners. We see this right at the start of the Bible, don't we? After Adam and Eve sin, and they are guilty of rebellion against God, they hear the sound of the Lord in the garden, and they hide from his presence. Because knowing their guilt, God's presence to judge them is not something that they want to face. But we also see in those chapters, in the first part of Genesis, that God shows up and he does pronounce judgment. But he doesn't pronounce a final word of judgment against Adam and Eve. He pronounces the curse upon Satan and effects of Adam and Eve's sin upon creation and humanity, but then he also manifests his presence in grace to them. And this is dominant in the Bible, the relational presence of God in grace for his people. So we can see, as we look through the story of the Bible, that God being with his people, God being present with his people, meant they were accepted, they were protected, and they were blessed. For God to be with us is for us to be accepted, protected, and blessed. Let me just throw out a few passages we could add to this 10 times over, but a few passages that make this very clear and show us the magnificent importance of God being with us in grace, his presence with us in grace. In Exodus chapter 3, for example, God appears to Moses in the burning bush, and he says, I've heard the cry of my people suffering in slavery in Egypt, and I have come to rescue them out of Egypt. And he says to Moses, I'm going to send you. Then we read this in verses 11 and 12. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Moses is saying, you want me to do this? Who am I that I could possibly do this? God says to him, but I will be with you. I will be with you, Moses. This is what guarantees this whole salvation thing. This is what guarantees your success. This is what guarantees your acceptance and your protection and your blessing. I will be with you. So he was with Moses, and so in bringing the people up out of Egypt, he was with the people. We read this in Exodus 13, as he's just rescued the people from Egypt. We read, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. Remember, God was with them in this pillar of fire by night, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. He manifested his presence with them. And it's emphasized in the story. It did not depart from before the people. This is what assured them of acceptance. This is what protected them and led them to blessing. The very next chapter, we see the protection when this Spirit of God present with his people once and for all wipes out the army of Pharaoh and Egypt. And then that pillar of cloud and pillar of fire leads them through the wilderness to blessing. We come to Joshua, and we read in Joshua, as the people are entering the land, God commissions Joshua, and he says, be strong and courageous. And why, Joshua? This is in Joshua chapter 1. Why, Joshua, are you to be strong and courageous? Is it because of something in you? Is it because of something you're able to do? No, it's because I will be with you. Hear the words of Joshua chapter 1, verses 5 and 6. God says to him, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them, because I will be with you. You know this is going to happen, and you can be strong and courageous. We can also think, can't we, of Psalm 23, a psalm we all know very well. At the heart of the psalm, the heart of this very familiar psalm, Psalm 23, are the words, for you are with me. Remember the words, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I will not fear any kind of evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. It's very clear, isn't it? God is with his people in grace, assuring them of his acceptance, protection, and blessing. This means God being with us, we have nothing to fear. Now, I want you to think about this a minute. Kids, I want you to think about this. This is a very hard concept for us to fully embrace. So let's think about it maybe in a couple stages. I want you to imagine, first of all, an imaginary scenario, but I think it might help us to get to where we can better imagine and understand and embrace the true situation we're in. But the imaginary situation I want you to start with is I want you to think about someone like the Hulk being your buddy and always being with you. And you can decide between the classic, a little bit chaotic Hulk or the new in-game Hulk. I don't prefer the in-game Hulk. I'm going to go with the classic. But either way, big, strong, powerful, seemingly, apparently indestructible. And you imagine this Hulk is always with you, meaning on your side, ready to help and to protect you. And you would have nothing to fear. I mean, if an army comes against you with tanks and they're firing missiles at you, whatever, we all know what Hulk can do. Aliens coming down from a different dimension, not a problem. The Hulk's got it. We would be perfectly protected. And so in your ordinary everyday life, of course, you'd walk around no fear whatsoever because the Hulk is with you. Now, we can imagine what that might be like. But the amazing fact is, the truth of our situation, though harder to imagine, is actually far, far greater. Because we don't simply have a Hulk with us, and not simply because he's imaginary, but the one we have with us is the infinite, all-powerful God of the universe, who is with us in the fullness of his being, in the fullness of his power, in the fullness of his ability, all the time, at every moment, knowing exactly what is happening because he is fully present in every situation we face. He's fully present in every molecule in our bodies. He knows every little hair that falls from our head. He knows every little situation we get into. And he is fully present with us always to protect us and to bless us. Therefore, we should have no fear. We can live without fear. Now, adults, parents, I want you to think about it in terms of money. You know, having the Hulk, yeah, we're not so concerned about that. But if there was a really, really wealthy man that was with us, following us around, ready to pay for whatever we needed, that would give us some real security. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Jenkins, whoever it might be, just someone with bills ready to slap down at a moment's notice. We would, in many situations, live with a lot more comfort and a lot less fear, because a lot of our fear is financial. Well, the Bible speaks directly to this, and it applies the reality of God's presence to the financial situation. In Hebrews chapter 13, hear these words: "Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you." So we can confidently say, "The Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me?" You see, don't be a lover of money. Don't put your trust in money. Don't have your hope set on money, but rather live free from the love of money and in contentment no matter what you're struggling with, because the one who owns the universe has promised he will never leave you. The one who is above monetary wealth, who you know, all the gold in the world is just a drop in the bucket compared to the resources and richness of him. He's in control of it all, and he says, I will never leave you or forsake you. So we can say, I will not fear. The Lord is my helper. This is amazing. God is with his people, graciously present with his people, and that means acceptance, protection, and blessing. Now, one more passage that really beautifully demonstrates the presence of God with his people and leads us to understand in a very rich way why we can say that God is present with us in his grace. Another passage that displays this fact is Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. Let's look at this. Let's see the presence of God brought out in this passage such that his people are protected and blessed. And then we're going to think about how this points us and assures us of the fact that he is present with us in his grace, that we can be assured of this great presence of God for us, even though we are sinners. So Daniel chapter 3, you remember the story of the fiery furnace, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so what happens in this story is Daniel has just been promoted, and he asked, after being promoted, that his friends be promoted. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get promoted with Daniel. And then Nebuchadnezzar decides he's going to make this massive idol, this massive statue, maybe a statue of himself. And he sends out a decree after having made this massive statue that when everyone hears the band play, they are to fall down and they are to worship this image. And if they don't, they're going to get thrown into this fiery furnace, this massive pit or this massive oven of fire. Now that's quite a consequence. You either worship this statue, this idol, this false god, or you get thrown into a fiery furnace. And so the band plays, and as we would expect, most everybody falls down and they worship this idol. But there were some who didn't. And some of the guys in charge that were no doubt jealous of Daniel, no doubt jealous of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they came and they brought the report to the king that these certain Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these certain Jews had not obeyed the king's edict and had not fallen down and worshiped the statue. And so King Nebuchadnezzar is furious, and he brings the men in and he says, "What is this I hear? You heard the sound of the band play, but you did not fall down and worship the idol. You're going to get thrown into the fiery furnace, and there is no God that's going to be able to save you from my hand." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego respond in this way. They answered and said to the king, this is Daniel 3:16, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and he commands that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be thrown into the fiery furnace. But first he says, I want you to heat that fiery furnace up way hotter than it is normally. Push the limits of this furnace. Let's get it super hot so that when they get thrown in, they are instantly vaporized. So what they do is they bind, according to his command, they bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Tie them up, bind them, and then they throw them into the furnace. And the furnace was so hot, we are told that the men who threw them into the furnace get destroyed by the flames. But what happens? They fell into the burning fiery furnace. But then King Nebuchadnezzar, verse 24, was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did you not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps and the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, Their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire, no, not even a smell, had come upon them. King Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Now notice a couple things here. God is able to save his servants from the power of Babylon. I recently heard a great message by a fellow pastor, William Godfrey, out in California on this. And it's such a beautiful thing. The message is very clear in this passage, and it's quite simple but amazing. God saves them from the power of Babylon, and he's able to save them absolutely and completely, such that they don't even smell. They don't even smell of the fire. The only thing that the fiery furnace harmed was their bonds. It burned up their bonds, but did not touch them. And this was the result of what? Of God being with them. As King Nebuchadnezzar says, wait, didn't we throw 3 men bound in there? But I see 4 men unbound. And the 4th is like a son of the gods. This is the pagan king acknowledging that, wait a minute, this 4th figure is representing God. And I think it's clear. This is the second person of the Trinity. This is Jesus before he became a man showing up as the angel of the Lord, which he does numerous times in the Old Testament. He shows up as the angel of the Lord, God himself, showing up as an angelic form with his people, saving them, indicating that it is God's presence with his people that powerfully rescues them. God's presence with his people, even in a fiery furnace, powerfully rescues them. But I'm pointing out this story, and I'm pointing out the fact that this 4th one with them in the fire, who looked like a son of the gods, was in fact the Son of God, because this story points us to the ultimate presence of God with us in Jesus Christ. I want you to think with me. As I've been saying repeatedly, God is graciously present with his people. But how can we really be assured that his presence with us is one of grace? How can we really be assured of that when God being with us means he is with us every single time we sin? He knows our sin, every little bit of it. He's never off somewhere else, distracted by someone else's sin, such that some of our guilt just gets kind of passed by. No, God is fully present with us for all of our sin. He knows it better and more thoroughly than we do. So how can we be assured that he is with us in grace and that he will never leave us in grace because we so struggle with sin? It's so present in our lives. It's omnipresent in our lives. How do we know God is going to be always with us in grace? Well, we know it because of how God's presence has been manifested in the Lord Jesus Christ. That saving work back in Daniel 3, the one like a son of the gods rescuing his people, points us to the rescue that the Son of God does in fact accomplish for all of us. And the Son of God accomplishes it by grace. He manifests the grace of God. So think with me now about what we could call the incarnational presence of God with his people. God with us in Jesus Christ. In the first place, we can say that Jesus is quite literally God with us. Jesus is God with us. I mean, Matthew, in fact, says that literally. Let me read to you Matthew chapter 1. It's a passage you'll remember from Christmas time. Matthew 1, beginning at verse 18. Now the birth of Jesus took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So notice, first of all, his name is to be Jesus because he is God showing up in grace to save his people from their sins. Then we read, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Jesus is God with us, literally. And he's God with us in grace. He's God with us to rescue us from our sin. God himself took on human nature in order to be with us so that he could live for us and he could die for us and fully rescue us from all of our sin. As John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus was with us as a man to know our suffering. God himself knows your suffering. He can be with you in suffering, not only because he's omnipresent, but he can be with you in suffering fully, in grace and understanding, because in Jesus, he has suffered what we suffer. He is with us in order to obey God for us. He was with us as a man so that he could take on all of our responsibility before God. All of what God's law requires of us. Jesus has been with us in order to obey all of God's law for us. He was with us by taking on our sin, taking on our guilt. Now you talk about intimacy. You talk about being with us. He's so with us that he took on our guilt. He put it on himself. So with us that he was forsaken by the Father. So with us, the sinner, he was forsaken by the Father. But so with us, the sinners, that he has removed all of our guilt from us so that we as sinners can be brought near to God, can be with God, God with us in perfect, peaceful harmony because God has been with us in Jesus Christ. So it's by Christ's incarnational presence with us that God is guaranteed to be with us no matter our sin, guaranteed to be with us in grace. God's presence with us means that we have no reason to fear whatever difficulties we are facing. With us, such that we don't need to be afraid. And when we are afraid, we need to remember God in all of his power and glory is with me. But God is so with us in Jesus in grace that we can say, even when we have sinned, my God is still for me. When we are afraid, we need to remember the presence of God in all of his power for us. When we are guilty, we need to remember the presence of God in Jesus and know that he is with us fully in grace, forgiving us, never forsaking us.